persuaded by Cheney's speech. How about that brand new national security strategic document that we just issued last week? A lot of them don't like this idea of preemption, so we got to give them something substantive to hang on to. Well, what could that be? Well, how about the ties between Iraq and al-Qaeda? I mean, that's, tie that with 9/11, that's going to work. Damn, we can't do that. Why not? Well, those wimps over there in the CIA, they still can't find any good evidence, they say, Chalabi and those fellows, they'd find it. They'll give us what evidence we pay for. But those guys, so if we make it on that rationale, those fellows from the analysts from the CIA will come behind us and pull the rug right out from under us, so we can't do that. Well, okay, how about, biological chemical weapons? We know they had them, Bam, bummer. The Defense Intelligence Agency has just written a formal memo which says that we don't know that they have these biological and chemical weapons, and we certainly don't know whether they're producing them. So again, if we go to Congress with this rationale, we'll get shot in the foot by these wimps over there, Defense Intelligence Agency. What are we going to do? Oh, I know. What we really need to do is make a case for this nuclear thing. I mean, that's what Vice President Cheney did so well. He did a great job, Dick. Now we have to make that stick. Now, what do we have in terms of evidence? Aluminum tubes. Condoleezza, remember, you did a great job on the radio there last Sunday about saying those aluminum tubes could only be used for a nuclear application, centrifuges. That'll do it. Well, I'm sorry, but I have touched base with the experts now at the Department of Energy, and they dismiss that possibility. They say that these aluminum tubes could never be used in an application, or if they did, they say pretty much that if Saddam Hussein thinks he can use that, have him order as many as he wants and unpay as much as he wants, because it'll never work. So we can't use that either. Bummer. Well, somebody says, how about that report that Iraq was seeking uranium from the African country there? What was it? Niger. Yeah, that'll do it. Uranium. They only can use uranium. That's what we can use. If George Tenet was there, he would have had to say, well, yeah, we looked into that, and it's false on its face. I mean, the government of Niger doesn't have the power to sell or give uranium to Iraq. All the uranium mined in Niger is controlled by an international consortium run by the French. Every ounce that's mined there is controlled. It couldn't happen on the face of it. And besides, we just found out that the original report's based on a forgery. So it's sort of like a false lie, So we can't use that. Why can't we use that? Well, who knows about this stuff? Who knows that it's based on a forgery? Who knows that it's false on its face? Well, nobody else. The UN has been banging on our door they heard about this, they want access, but we haven't let them have access to this. Well, how long can we put the UN off? Oh, I imagine a couple more months. Ha! So what's your problem? We'll use this Iraqi search for uranium in Niger as evidence, tangible evidence, of an Iraqi nuclear program, and we'll raise the specter of a mushroom cloud. That'll do it with the congressman. Who wants to take a risk that the first evidence might be a mushroom cloud? So let's do that. We'll persuade the House and the Senate to vote for the war. We'll have a war, and we'll win handily. I mean, the Iraqi forces are on their back. We know that from all the sanctions and everything else. We'll win it in a couple weeks. And then the people will welcome us with open arms and cut flowers. And then who's going to care? I mean, they ask you, who's going to care if the original rationale, the original cell job was based on a forgery or based on something that was false on its face? Who's going to give it at that point? And so they went, and besides, Karl Rove is in these discussions. And besides, we got an election coming up in about 6 weeks. Just think how hard it's going to be for Democrats to vote to endanger this country to a mushroom cloud. And I think we can really play this for all it's worth. Those who vote against it, they're going to be in real trouble, maybe. And so we might even make gains in this midterm election. So, yeah, this seems like a really good idea, and that's exactly what they did. It's the most crass, the most cynical, the most deceitful campaign that I've ever seen in terms of any country justifying a decision to make war. My own country gives me no joy to say that, but in retrospect, it's even clearer with the absence of weapons of mass destruction, with the president himself now admitting that there were no ties between Saddam Hussein and 9/11, and with these ex post facto, these explanations, retroactive explanations that, well, no, we really want to just get rid of Saddam Hussein, or no, what we really want to do is democracy in Iraq. We're going to impose democracy on Iraq, whether they like it or not, and we'll make sure that we hang in there with our forces and maybe with our 4 military bases, and it would be nice to sit on top of all that oil. So it just was quite remarkable. Now, we saw this coming, and the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, starting with Secretary Powell's speech on the 5th of February this year, we documented all this. We sent 4 memoranda to the president himself, made no secret of it, put it on the websites. Some of it was published, mostly in the foreign press, interestingly enough, not in the U.S. press. But we could see it coming. As a matter of fact, this famous State of the Union address where the president was fed information that was patently false, we had an article in the Birmingham News that day in the morning which warned the president, please check this out with your intelligence experts. Don't let your political folks have you shooting yourself in the foot with hyperbole, And in retrospect, that one really looks like we were right on the mark. So it's not as though this was a big secret to anybody who was paying attention. And of course, our allies, who are feeding off precisely the same intelligence base, came to their own conclusions. The French and the Germans, for example, with whom we share virtually everything, could see that this was all contrived. Could see that some of their sources, which they had reported with great caveats, saying, well, we don't know about this fellow. He says he's in touch. We're not sure he has this right access or whether he's telling the truth. He has an unproven record. Well, they see Colin Powell starting his speech, citing the information from those same sources, saying this is absolutely solid intelligence. And so they knew what the game was. They could also read the Project for a New American Century documents.
So on March 14th, there was an AP story by John Lumpkin who was talking about your plea for intelligence professionals to leak information or to get information out there. And the spokesman for the CIA, Mark Mansfield, said, well, Ray, he's been retired for 10 years. He doesn't really have any, way to know any of this information. What's your response to that?
Well, I would just simply say, where are the weapons of mass destruction? Ray was saying there weren't any. Or if there are some, they're certainly not there in the quantity that would, by any stretch of the imagination, justify a war. And so where are they, It's interesting that the press spokesman for the agency would dismiss us with such kid gloves. I mean, they could do other things like they did to Valerie Lane and so forth. But they all know that we sort of graduated with honors, so to speak. They all know that we have copious encomia from the president's father. And they all know that we have our own reputation among the analysts in the CIA. And so they have to be careful with respect to how far out they go in impugning our integrity or impugning our knowledge. It's a no-brainer. Any political scientist worth his or her salt, who knows the least bit about media analysis, could have seen, just as we did, what was going to happen. We were still shocked that nobody blew the whistle on it. Just Andrew Wilkie in Australia. We were still shocked that there was no one that followed the example of Daniel Ellsberg, who admits that he did it too late, We were shocked that there were so many good people with integrity that we left behind us in the intelligence apparatus that didn't see what was coming and speak out beforehand. Now I do have hope that those hundreds, and there are literally hundreds who know about the lies, that as they retire perhaps, and as they pay off their mortgages or their kids graduate from college, that they'll feel a little freer to say, yeah, this is what happened.
At any point during the 8 months in the build-up, were you in contact with anyone that was still working with the CIA, or was all your information directly from open source?
No, it's sort of like the 90% ratio again. 90% from sharing with one another and from the open sources, but a very vital 10%, not from clandestine sources, but from sources within the intelligence community, people who are still there, who are sort of, whose morale has been really shot, but who are hanging in there trying to hope against hope that they'll live to fight another day when a leadership comes in that will allow them to do the job that they're paid to do, and that is to assemble all the information and then convey it analytically without fear or favor, with no policy agendas or axes to grind.
On February 24th, Newsweek broke the Hussein Kamal story, and then it was kind of ignored for a few days. But immediately, Bill Harlow of the CIA denounced it and said it's totally untrue. What do you say about? Do you really think that he was telling the truth, or was he protecting the agency in that case? What do you make of that situation, and kind of recap that?
Well, the objective or the job of the CIA spokesman or woman is to protect the agency. That's the job. And so when Hussein Kamal, when it became known that Hussein Kamal, whom everyone from the president on down had touted as the epitome of how much a defector can really help in contributing to our knowledge base, when it turned out that he also said, in addition to the information he gave about chemical and biological warfare, he also said that all those chemical and biological weapons and resources were destroyed at his order when he told us that in 1995. That somehow never got out, and it took a very enterprising person from Cambridge, Glenn Walla, to go over to Vienna and find the debriefing report, and then to report that. Now, there's a big story. How big a story? How can you get a bigger story than the head of the chemical, biological, nuclear, and strategic missile program in Iraq, Saddam Hussein's son-in-law, who was in charge of all that, tells us when he defected in 95 that those weapons, there were no nuclear weapons, but the others were all destroyed at his order, okay? Everything else he told us panned out pretty well. The president, everybody else says he's a great source, but nobody acknowledged that he also said that. And so Newsweek gets this story. Where do they put it? Periscope, little blurb there in the beginning. Most people just buy that, and nobody takes much notice of it. We took notice of it. I mean, that seemed to be the answer. Why were they having such trouble? Why couldn't they give evidence of where these things were to the UN inspectors? Well, the answer could be, could it not, that Kamal Hussein was telling the truth in this respect as well. Of course, it turns out that he did tell the truth, and then these weapons were destroyed then. Hans Blix has an interesting way of putting it. He was the chief UN weapons inspector. He said, it was really remarkable that the U.S. government had 100% certainty that they were weapons of mass destruction, and 100% uncertainty about where they were. Yeah, it's kind of hard to conceive that you would be so certain that these weapons existed if you didn't have any evidence where they were. What was the evidence? These defective reports that the Defense Department was paying through the nose for Chalabi and his emigres to manufacture. Why were they not dismissed out of hand? Well, I'll tell you one reason that hasn't really come out very much. It used to be that the Central Intelligence Agency had a crackerjack outfit called the National Photographic Interpretation Center, and it was their job to analyze all imagery that came down from the skies. Not to collect it, that was always the Pentagon, but to analyze it and to drive the collection, to inform what needed to be collected. These were the folks that discovered the missiles in Cuba. These are the folks that made it possible for us to tell President Reagan, yes, we can verify arms control agreements. So it's just a very, very essential function that they would perform. These were the folks that were able to say, no, they don't have 3,000 SS-25s, they only have 20, and these are the photos that can prove that, So this body of some 600, 700 well-experienced analysts was given to the Pentagon, taken off, lopped off from the CIA, and given to the Pentagon in 1996 by John Deutsch, who was then director of the CIA, and who had made no disguise of his pretensions to become Secretary of Defense. Well, why do I mention that? I mention that for this reason. In the old days, if we had a defective report that said a chemical facility is under construction at these coordinates, first thing an analyst would do would be target the photography, get a picture of it, and compare that with previous pictures and say yes or no. Well, now, who controls the imagery analysis? Donald Rumsfeld. Okay. Now he's got a favorite defector saying there are 3 chemical facilities here. Get the photography. It's going to take a very courageous young analyst to say, nah, they're talking through their nose. And even if he has that courage, the major that he works for is going to say, ooh, so am I going to tell the colonel this? And the colonel, if it gets that far, the colonel going to tell the general? And is the general going to tell Rumsfeld that these favorite sources of his don't know what they're talking about? I don't think so. And so the function of the Central Intelligence Agency, which is to tell it like it is without fear of favor, has been not only corrupted with what they're still doing, but this whole unit was lopped off, and so it's ipso facto no longer able to speak objectively. It reports to the Secretary of Defense. And so why was it that all these reports were given the credibility that they didn't deserve? Well, there's no check on them. Or if there was a check, people were too intimidated to speak out and say, hey, Mr. Rumsfeld, your emperor has no clothes on, neither does Chalabi.
Okay. I'm going to go through kind of the lightning round here. And I'm going to give you the timeline and then think about whether or not there was enough information that the media could have followed up on, or if it was, they did their best job to get all the information.
I'm going to ask you, excuse me while I just go to the men's room for a second.
Okay. Retrace and kind of put yourself back as if it was, you don't know any information other than what you know up to that point. It may be a little tricky, but just think. I'll try to run through in order so you can build up. Recording.
Let me know if I'm not getting it right,
Okay. Yeah, and if it's something that's off point, or I'll just stop and go. Okay, so what were your thoughts when you heard Cheney's speech on August 26th?
I said, my God, it's still August. I thought this marketing campaign was going to be rolled out, in September. It was very, very curious because it was of a tone and a degree and a vehemence that had not been present in any of the other speeches, including Rumsfeld and the president. And so it was really clearly a preemptive attack here, so to speak, and that would happen before they all go back to Washington seemed to me transparent. And yet I saw none of this in the press. I mean, where were the journalists who could take a look at this and say, this is strange. It wasn't supposed to be in August, number one, and is the Vice President speaking for everyone,
And, let's see. Okay. The links to al-Qaeda, which let's do on September 8th is when they kind of kicked off the aluminum tubes, and they had Cheney. And when I say this, try to just recap the event. Cheney, Powell, Rumsfeld, Rice, and Dick Myers were all on the Sunday talk shows talking about the aluminum tubes.
Yeah, the aluminum tubes was a really interesting episode. It was very clearly coordinated with the British and with the New York Times and Washington Post and so forth. And the point of it all, of course, was to have some tangible proof that what Cheney had just said was correct, namely that the Iraqis were seeking nuclear weapons. Condoleezza Rice went the furthest, and she said, well, these aluminum tubes could only be used in a nuclear application. And this, of course, was before she checked with the Department of Energy experts, and these are the experts there, and they laughed themselves silly. Saying, if Saddam Hussein thinks he can use these in a nuclear application, have him buy as many, sell him as many as you want. He's in for a sorrowful surprise because they can't be used that way. They're not suitable. They're for rockets. And of course, they turn out to be right. So, but the cynicism here is that the administration knew that they would turn out to be false, but all they were working with was a time frame of a couple of weeks where they needed to persuade Congress that there was evidence that the first sign, as they put it, the first sign that Saddam Hussein has nuclear weapons would appear in the form of a mushroom cloud. The president said that on the 7th of October. Condoleezza Rice said that on the 8th of October. Victoria Clark of the Pentagon said that on the 9th of October. And on the 10th and the 11th, Congress voted to cede their power to declare war to the President of the United States. Incredible. Never in my 40 years in this town, never in my knowledge of history of our country, has one branch of government so deliberately, so crassly and cynically deceived another branch of government, persuading that other branch to cede its constitutional duty and its right to declare war. And so there is a constitutional crisis here. Pity the fact that our founding fathers never perceived there would be a situation where there would be two main parties. And so when they wrote the impeachment articles, they were counting on being able to rely on reasonable men, and unfortunately they were all men in those days, reasonable men being able to decipher what a high crime misdemeanor is. They never foresaw a situation where people would be so constrained by party affiliation that, as is now the case with both houses of Congress and the White House being controlled by the same political party, that the majority of these party members will feel unable to speak out and say, yes, I suppose deceiving us into a decision to wage an unprovoked war, I guess that probably qualifies as at least a misdemeanor, wouldn't you say? Instead of that, the Republican majority is able to rein in their people to the point where the impeachment provisions of the Constitution cannot be implemented. This is not to say that they should not be, that kind of legislation should not be introduced, but it just is very important to note that that even this egregious deception of one branch by the other has not been addressed here, and the press has sort of yawned and just reported Jessica Lynch and things like that, and missed the constitutional issue here.
Little light falls across his face.
Okay, if maybe have you scoot back a little bit.
Sure.
That's good.
Is that better?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And so, in your judgment, looking at the media in this time period, do you think that they did the best job they could?
Oh no.
Okay, hold on.
I'm sorry. I think the media had a miserable performance here. I just should have known, I suppose. 2 years ago, we had a big reunion of those of us who were involved in Vietnam back in the early 70s when the Pentagon Papers were published by the New York Times and the Washington Post, 71, I believe that was. So it was 30 years. And Daniel Ellsberg and others were all there. some of the correspondence. But all of the people who were at middle levels then, like Rick Smith and from the Times, no longer with the Times, and other people, some of the lawyers who were involved, they were all so proud. And Dan Elberg made a speech, and everyone was patting themselves on the back. We really faced up to to Richard Nixon. He did, for the first and only time in our history, issue a restraining order, pre-publication restraining order. We went ahead anyway. Were we courageous, and did we do the right thing? We thought we'd all end up in jail maybe, but we did the right thing. Then a lady raised her hand. She said, "Tell me, suppose there was a similar situation today. Suppose there was a Pentagon Papers today that needed to be published." Must have been, it seemed like 5 minutes. It must have been about 45 seconds of complete silence. Finally, Rick Smith, previously of the New York Times, spoke up, and he cleared his throat, and he said, "Well, I wouldn't count on it today. I wouldn't count on the fact that our papers would publish today." And the next person said, "Yeah, probably not today." By the time they went down the line, consensus was, forget about it today. And I said to myself, wow, there it is. There it is right there. These are the people still employed by these wonderful exemplars of the Fourth Estate, and they're saying that the Pentagon Papers, that their management wouldn't publish them today. There's a sea change. And so when I watched the cheerleading for the war,
yeah. And maybe if I could have you recap, the history, or just maybe in 4 or 5 sentences, the Pentagon Papers and them not being published today.
Okay. Yeah. We got a lot of police around here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. When, on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the publication of the Pentagon Papers in 71, this was 2 years ago, we had a little gathering of those who were involved there, and there was great pride exhibited in the fact that they went ahead and published them. And someone asked, well, would that happen today? And the answer was long in coming, like a whole minute of absolute silence. And then the people still with the New York Times and the Washington Post conceded that don't count on it, probably wouldn't happen today. No, wouldn't happen today. So there's a sea change there, a real sea change in how our press operates. And instead of that kind of thing, what we observed in the lead up to the war was a whole bunch of cheerleading, a whole bunch of simply accepting at face value the propaganda that was being emitted. It reminded me of the Gulf War I, where that little Kuwaiti girl made that story about the incubators and the Iraqi soldiers coming in and throwing the babies on the floor and all that stuff. And it worked. It was the same sort of thing. It worked for the time it needed to work. And it was later found out that it was made out of whole cloth, and she was the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter. But it was enough to persuade not only Congress, but the UN to say, well, these Iraqis are really terrible. We have to give President Bush the power, the permission to wage war. So it's this pattern of being able to maintain the deception long enough to get what you want. And then when it comes out later, who's going to care? Or, they'll put it on page 828 and we'll escape, we'll achieve our aim. It's really, I suppose I should no longer be surprised by it, but as an American, I really am. There's one other point about this.
What? Let's get back.
Okay. My colleagues and I were really baffled by these weapons of mass destruction claims. There were so many disconnects there. Why didn't they share that information with the UN? Why was it that every time they sent the UN out, it was a wild goose chase? They didn't find anything. Why was it that people came out from Congress when they were briefed by Rumsfeld and Cheney, sort of shaking their heads and saying, well, that wasn't very persuasive? And so that was always kind of a real conundrum for us. And we proceed pretty collegially, so when someone drafts something, we kind of get everybody to, we don't reduce it to the lowest common denominator, but we're sharply engaged. And I wanted to say there aren't any weapons of mass destruction, And I listen to my colleagues who are a little bit more restrained, and I respect them very much. And the consensus was that the President of the United States has said that there were about 10 times in the last month. The Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, the Assistant for National Security. And they're not saying probably, they're saying they are there. So they must have something. They must have something and not sharing with anybody. And, the President of the United States, should deserve the benefit of the doubt, Okay, well, I relented and said, okay, it really is strange that they would be saying this so boldly and so often and so definitively. Maybe my friends are right. Now it turns out that our trust was misplaced. That this president does put out information that is wrong, boldly, numerous times, definitively, with great rhetorical emphasis. And so the question now is, what should the presumption be when the president is talking about something important? That he's telling the truth or that he's not telling the truth? And I have to say that that not only in this area but in domestic policy and other things, my presumption, and I hate to say this because I'm a loyal American, is that we have to look very closely at what the president is saying. And we can no longer give him the benefit of the doubt that he's telling the truth, because on this key issue, clearly was not telling the truth about weapons of mass destruction. He was not telling the truth about ties between al-Qaeda and Iraq. And those were the two reasons, ostensible reasons, given for waging an unprovoked war.
What are some of the leads that the press could have followed up on that you remember? Little nuggets that you heard of, like a big red flag would go up and say, "Oh, hey, that's interesting. I would like to see some follow up on that." And not.
Yeah. Well, there were some administration spokesmen, senior administration officials who would be quoted by this or that journalist saying, there may not be many weapons of mass destruction, or if you're looking for a big stockpile, there may not be any there. Well, why didn't they go after those people? Say, what do you mean there may not be any? Instead, it was sort of at the bottom of a story. Pat Roberts, the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee. I remember him coming out of a meeting by Rumsfeld and Cheney, and he came out and one of the reporters said, well, what does it look like? How is the evidence of weapons of mass destruction? And Senator Roberts said, oh, it's compelling. And the journalist said, well, can you give me an example? He said, yeah. He said, here's an example. He said, photography has shown truck A going under shed B where process C is believed to occur. And so the reporter says, Senator, you find that compelling? He said, oh, yes, very compelling. They've cut this down to a real science. The reporter just left scratching his head. Now, that should have been a major story. If that was as compelling as the evidence got, then we were in trouble, and we were.
Okay. And let's see. So in this whole process, it seemed like there's a whole slew of alternative competing hypotheses that were not even explored. And so can you talk about kind of the process that could have happened by the press to kind of dig into those, or to even think about it in terms of other alternatives?
You mean weapons of mass destruction?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the press played an awful game on these weapons of mass destruction. You'll recall that after the invasion of Iraq started, there were none found immediately, except, there was a report that was somewhere found, and that report that somewhere found would get on page 1 of the Washington Post and New York Times. And then 3 days later, they turned out not to be weapons of mass destruction. That would get on page A28, okay? And there were at least 10 of those instances. This Judith Miller, who's a spokesman for Chalabi and others, she got front page treatment for a lot of these things, and her sourcing was, on the face of it, dubious. And yet, front page New York Times, this weapons of mass destruction found. 3 days later, page 28. No, they weren't turned. So they should have smelled a rat right away. And then the answers given by the Pentagon, why have there been no weapons of mass destruction found? Well, we got more important things to do. We're fighting an enemy. We're waging a war. Well, I was in the Army. I was an Army officer. And if I had any suspicion at all that there were weapons of mass destruction to be used against my troops, that would be priority number one, I'll tell you. I would have found whatever chemical and biological weapons were out there. And that's how that would be the first step that I would use in fighting this war. And it's just inconceivable to me that the press would take that as a kind of an okay explanation,
Points. Okay. Okay. So let's see. Why don't you talk a little bit about what kind of thoughts are going through your head, maybe in a minute or two, when on March 7th you heard about the Niger forgeries for the first time officially from IAEA.
Is it from El Baradei?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was watching the Security Council session there. On that day, I was home in the morning, and I was open-mouthed in astonishment when El Baradei said in most diplomatic terms that information on Iraq seeking uranium in Niger was, as he put it, not authentic. Not authentic. Not authentic? What do you mean? You never say not authentic diplomatically unless it was a forgery or something like that. And so it came out that it was a forgery. And I said, God, this report that was false on its face, now we know it was based on a forgery? How are we gonna deal with this one? Well, you know how we dealt with that one? Colin Powell grew up in the same part of the Bronx that I did. He was a year ahead of me in school. We lived about a mile away from each other, didn't know each other at the time. But I know the lingo in the Bronx, and when you're really caught like this, as he was with one of the Sunday talk shows, and they said, well, what do you make of this, this exposing of this as not authentic? And he said, well, if that was not right, fine. Well, that kind of tone would always have been accompanied by an obscene gesture where I grew up and where he grew up. At least he spared us the obscene gesture, but the attitude was just incredibly arrogant, and that is sort of the hallmark of the folks that he associates with now.
Okay, and maybe to finish up the links with Iraq and al-Qaeda, give maybe a few minute summary of that.
Well, it was very clear that we could smell a rat on that from day one, because at 9/11, of course, we know that Donald Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz were already saying, let's go get Iraq now. But the most telling thing for me came out later, and it was Wesley Clark going on TV that same day and getting a call from the White House saying, blame it on Iraq. Now, Wesley Clark.
Well, I just want to interrupt. That was after. So I'm talking about the time frame of just if you can remember stuff that was leaking out from reports.
Yeah. Well, it was very clear that there was a propaganda campaign here, and so those of us who know about such things were always distrustful that this had any real substance to it. The ties between 9/11 and al-Qaeda were pretty clear. Colin Powell promised a white paper on that, which he never delivered, and now it's clear why that happened. It wasn't that there wasn't enough evidence; there was too much evidence, and people would have said, "Well, why didn't you do something about it if you knew about that?" But what a stretch it would be to link that to Iraq. Iraq and Osama bin Laden were enemies. Iraq was. Saddam Hussein was accused of being an infidel by Osama bin Laden. So, it just didn't parse. And those of us who've been around a while could see that it didn't parse. And the real miracle was that our press couldn't see that for what it was.
Okay, great. I think that's it.